You'll see it's quite busy. And I will just share a quasi sheets as I can, quasi presentation. So hopefully people will, I'll be able to zoom in things wide enough so you can see. There'll be some slides and stuff that may not exactly be applicable, but we'll work through that. Let me see if I can try this as presentation mode. It goes to the wrong screen. I need to switch it. Let's see. Do that. Which windows? No, I don't want to switch windows. So I'll escape that and just do it. Let's see. So yeah, today we're talking about the Emergency Watershed Protection, or EWP program. The objective of the program is to provide assistance in implementing emergency recovery measures for runoff retardation and erosion prevention to relieve imminent hazards to life and property created by a natural disaster that causes a sudden impairment of a watershed. So that can include a vast array of natural disasters. We've done EWP for tornadoes in North Carolina. We may be doing that again. Fire stuff is pretty common, particularly out west, and obviously floods and things like that. But really, any natural disaster could probably potentially be an unnatural disaster if it's some sort of massive scale. So, but that's straight from the manual. So, oftentimes when we're reading our manuals, I had not have my ghostly figure on the side there. We also need to kind of get some clarification as far as what things mean. So in the EWP for the purpose, we look at relieving imminent hazards. That means to protect lives and property threatened by conditions created by a natural disaster from further damage. There's a definition of an imminent threat. Substantial natural occurrence could cause significant damage in the near future. Watershed impairment, that's really very event specific. NRCS makes that call because it is our program. So, but some things are already defined for us in our manual, such as property. So property is defined as any artificial structure permanently affixed to the land. So buildings, infrastructure, potentially facilities that the public uses, roads potentially, but it also goes down to really as far as it's a protection program. It's not a repair program, and as the federal government can print money, or I should say our central bank or the Federal Reserve can print money, but it's there's always going to be a limit. So EWP is not necessarily the answer to every situation. But as conservationists, regardless of the resource concern we're not looking at it from a programmatic standpoint, at least hopefully we're not. We're looking at it from how do we address this resource concern, whether there's a program with it or not. And I can share from my experiences in Central Coast of California. We never had EWP, but we did plenty of very useful CTA for our customers in our counties, and they appreciated that. And my district conservationist, Rick Cassell, was a conservationist first. So I'd like us to remember that. Anyways, but for the program, getting back to EWP, value
Jim?
Yes.
Hey, really quick. So you had said that the EWP is to protect property, which includes anything that's a permanent structure on land. Does that include the land itself?
No, does not.
Okay.
And that's
so we can't do an EWP because of imminent danger of losing a lot of land. or something
Correct.
like that. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, so it is very specific in that way, as far as protecting property. Erosion occurs in watersheds naturally. So, and how the program looks at it is there are other programs within NRCS that can potentially address those situations, like EQIP. So, with the program itself, the value of what's being protected, be it some sort of quantification of the lives and property, must be greater than the cost to implement emergency conservation measures. And so how I look at this as a program manager is these are supposed to be emergency measures. It's not the full uh, stabilize the site for years to come. It's an emergency measure. So we want to do things, and particularly with disaster recovery, we have limited funds. We may have a lot of sites to deal with, as North Carolina and South Carolina do now. So we want to be sure that we're doing things efficiently, but they are also emergency measures. And I'll give some examples of that later on, maybe after we're done here. Let's see. NRCS will be the determinator of what qualifies for NRCS or doesn't. Uh, Again, it may fit a particular situation and it may not. And there can be priorities as well. As far as North Carolina, I suspect it will take a same route in South Carolina. EWP typically takes 1 to 2 years after an event to implement. And that's just because we do it through locally led agreements, which I really like because that fits with the ethos of our agency of locally led conservation. But it is time. And, for emergency stuff or for these disasters, what we typically look for is for our state and federal emergency, like FEMA or your state emergency management, to work out those situations that need to be addressed immediately. And they're typically pretty good at that, power, water, and then other situations that pop up. But in an EWP, we look at it as a mop up. It does have emergency in our name, but I'd say look at that as a geologic time scale, not necessarily emergency as far as the human time scale. So the watershed scale, because that's what we're trying to work with. And then NRCS only has authority. This sometimes comes up if we're interacting with our folks in FEMA, maybe our state emergency management. We only have authority for a particular site or set of sites once the sponsor accepts and the NRCS state conservationist, that's STC, has signed the damage survey report or has submitted it up to headquarters for funding. And as noted here, that maybe after some interactions with FEMA as well, because we don't want to double dip. We don't want to be applying stuff. And in North Carolina, we also have some state programs that deal with stream issues and debris. And so we don't want to be overlapping reaches or sites that are been assisted with funds from another source. What do I look at from a program manager standpoint? When I'm evaluating sites or the damage survey reports, from a professional judgment, is if there's actually an imminent hazard. A lot of times, especially up in these mountain streams, it's a boulder rock complex in the stream. The stream may be eroded out, but what's left behind is really relatively stable. It's going to stay in place for a while. Might not need to be addressed through EWP. And that kind of goes to the next bullet point, natural armoring. What these events should show us, I hope one thing we're taking away from this is nature wins. Okay? We can have stuff in place, but at the end of the day, nature will win. That's just shown to us through history. Various civilizations of the past, nature has won. But natural armor is the best. If we don't have to mess with it, don't. Be sure to utilize it. And I hope as conservationists, we are gaining some sort of sense of that as we're working our various jobs or areas. As always, benefits must outweigh the cost. If a structure is threatened, is the best alternative maybe to move it instead of messing around with the imminent threat. And then also, I'd like to emphasize, look at the surroundings when we're evaluating sites. This kind of gets into site evaluation as well, but vegetated banks to determine natural repose of soils, because oftentimes this is much steeper than one may think. And I often think of what comes to mind are some of our mountain roads. You know, those soils, there can be an upslope bank that's near vertical that's held for several years or decades. Not necessarily, not saying it will always hold, but you got to think about this when we're looking at emergency measures. We got to be smart and economical and efficient, I would say. Best way to put it. Let's see. EWP implemented through sponsors. So this is different too. We don't interact with the private landowners. Our emergency watershed protection program is implemented through sponsors, and that's defined as a state or political subdivision thereof, federally recognized Indian tribe or tribal organization, or unit of local government with these criteria: a legal interest in or responsibility for the values threatened by a watershed emergency. 2, capability to obtain necessary land rights. That comes in the form of right of entry and hold harmless agreements if for work that's done on private lands. The work can be done on private lands, but it's through the sponsor. So the sponsor is responsible for obtaining those land rights. 3, capabilities to carry out any operations and maintenance as a site requires. So this, we typically work out, as mentioned, EWP can be done on private landowners, can seek assistance through sponsors. Sponsors will make that determination if they want to take that on or not. And then usually, at least in North Carolina, how I've worked that out is but particularly for structural measures, there's really 2 types of measures. It's like non-structural, like debris removal and clearing out event or disaster related sediment and debris. That's non-structural. You remove it and carry it off or get rid of it or dispose of it properly, and it's done. Structural measures are ones that are designed, need some sort of additional engineering or land grading to put into place. And so with those kind of situations, typically, at least how I've come to terms with it within NRCS and EWP, is the sponsor can work with the private landowner to sign off or hand over O&M responsibilities to that landowner once the practice is implemented. Like typically shoreline, stream bank and shoreline protection, CPS 580. And then finally, the 4th item is capable of entering and administering a locally led grant agreement with NRCS and our FPAC partners to be able to provide engineering services, procurement, and management of construction, things like that. So they need to be able to manage the grant agreement and also procure services needed. It may just be some construction services if they're able to do their own designs, but it could also be trying to procure design services for structural practices. And as always, as noted, assistance to private landowners must be provided through a willing and capable sponsor. That's the big thing about EWP. It has to be done through a sponsor. Let's see.
Yeah. Can you go back to third? The O&M as a site requires. Not all the EWP required O&M.
Say that again, Govinda.
Not all EWP project required O&M agreement.
Yeah, no, yeah, precisely. Like particularly like with debris clearing and snagging operations, there's typically not an O&M component to that. For structural practices, there are, but not for non-structural practices. Let's see. So a timeline. So here's the ideal timeline. This is in the manual. And actually for manuals, for our agency manuals, anybody's into reading our agency manuals for various programs, the EWP manual is a pretty short read. I think it's less than 60 pages of a PDF form. But what it lays out there is within 60 days of an event happening, a sponsor should send in a request for assistance to our state conservationist, respected state conservationist. I often, at least for our larger events, I've done this for prior ones, Hurricane Florence, Tropical Storm Fred in North Carolina. We request a waiver on that because, when people are trying to get water and power back, it might be a while before they get around to thinking about what might qualify or not qualify for EWP. So this is what's in our manual. Within 60 days of receiving that request, NRCS and or partners, we have partners capable of doing that in North Carolina, complete a damage survey request and submit that to headquarters. Again, this can get stretched out. All of these are ideal. The reality that I've observed in my years of participating in EWP at various levels is this gets stretched out also. So for program managers, just be aware of that. And then there's supposed to be 220 days there for the agreement to be developed. If there's designs, contracting, review, construction, completion of work, and acceptance, it's supposed to be completed with 220 days after the funding is activated or provided at headquarters. Sometimes sponsors can make this if they're very focused and have procurement services. They might have a contractor on standby, let's say, or on retainer, things like that. They may have their own engineers. But again, this is where, from a programmatic side, it may stretch out. Hurricane Florence, just this past summer, our last sponsor finished their last structural implementation. That was little less than 6 years after the event. But it did hold up through the recent storms, so I can say that. From the North Carolina standpoint, we try to be as flexible as we can because it's a recovery program. Even though we have the E word in the title, it's a recovery program. And then after the agreement is finished, then there's 90 days to close stuff out, take care of finances if there are funds available that need to be de-obligated, stuff like that. So that's ideal. There are some things that we shouldn't be doing and that are ineligible. Here's an example. The project can't be caused by a lack of ongoing O&M or pre-disaster issues. So that comes up, like here you see a culvert that's partially filled with sediment already. This would not, and you can tell it's been there for a while because you can see vegetation growing through it. If it had been storm deposited sediment, that's from the event. That can certainly be addressed, but in this case, it's been there for a while, it would not be eligible. Another example is like if you have drainage systems and there's large trees growing up in the middle of the drainage ditches, well, there really shouldn't be trees in a drainage canal or drainage ditch. Another limitation is that if it's structural, it cannot be repaired more than twice within 10 years of EWP funding. North Carolina will be dealing with this with some of our stream activities that we've done through all of our programs, actually. As a conservationist, I know nature can heal itself. And so how much do we really want to try to reinvest that nature could take out by itself in a number of years. So, but for EWP, like if say we put some rip-wrapped slope on a site, and we can't have it repaired more than twice. If that happens, that just means EWP is not the answer. It needs to have some sort of real, not emergency measure, but a more permanent measure put into place. We cannot repair, rebuild, or maintain public or private transportation facilities. Roads and infrastructure are really out of the realm of EWP. We're looking at the watershed, not the infrastructure. If it's been damaged, now if it's under threat of being damaged, that would fit under EWP. But if it has been damaged, then we got to figure out if the repair of the road and infrastructure, that's covered by the sponsor. We may be able to utilize EWP for armoring the channel and maybe removing sediment. But again, that's a site by site situation. From in North Carolina, I typically discuss that with the sponsors, and we decide what the best way to move forward if they are still interested in utilizing EWP for a particular site.
Hey, Jeff,
Yep.
on the regulation on it can't be due to O&M
Right.
or a lack of maintenance on
Yep.
something. How realistically can you prove that or show that in I guess in a real world scenario, or do you just kind of get out there, you see something that looks like it's a lack of maintenance, and but you can't really, I mean, how do you make that kind of a decision?
That's somewhat just professional judgment. I mean, like the picture I showed, so it's obviously been there for a while because
Right.
it's got vegetation in it. It comes down to a professional judgment. Documentation is always with any engineering work. Documentation is an important part of that. So you
Okay.
document it when you're doing your site assessments and make that determination.
And then who makes the decision after you um, like you take a look at it, you say, well, this looks like a wall that wasn't maintained correctly, or there's been water dripping on it and it's weakened it. And when there was a flood, it broke through the wall. Um, now we're looking at replacing or fixing that situation. Um, who makes that? And you determine you think that it's from a lack of maintenance. Who makes the final call on that? Is that
Uh, the
the
the program manager would make that final call, but I would expect it to be a kind of a group consensus that it either does or does not, because all of our work, it's multidisciplinary. So there should be several sets of eyes looking on things. There's actually several layers of review. There's the local review, there's comes up to the state office for being submitted to headquarters for potential funding. And then headquarters reviews it as well. So, there's several sets of eyes looking at it.
okay?
We don't do work on Army Corps of Engineer structures that might hold for dikes or channels, potentially dams, things like that. That's their purview. That's based on the memorandum of or memo of agreement with the Corps of Engineers. Let's see, we don't do coastal erosion. North Carolina, we have inner and outer banks. Inner banks are eligible, but outer banks are not. And that also goes for like the Great Lakes, things like that. We can't, if we do debris or sediment removal from a channel, we should not be increasing the channel capacity past its pre-disaster capacity. Let's see. This may come up. There's no animal carcass disposal, but there can be situations. We're apparently seeing this on the ground in North Carolina, where these may actually cause imminent hazard. So again, typically our state partners and emergency management will handle this. This is a bit this is kind of might be a holdover from before we really had those systems or agencies up and operating within our respective states. So let's see, no landscaping or irrigation infrastructure repair. So this comes into play particularly for sites where it might be want to be beautified after it's done, like might be a park or something like that. Listen, we stabilize it with the emergency conservation measures, stabilize the site, and then that's it, not extra. That would fall on the sponsor to complete stuff like that. And then we also can't have other federal funds being applied to the same site. So your state, our respective states will be coordinating with our FEMA representatives, and typically FEMA public assistance or PA is applied to immediate threats. EWP can do some mop up. There may be some other federal agencies out there depending on the severity of the event. Either way, the site needs to be funded it can't be funded by other federal sources. All right, so that kind of covers a lot of the programmatic issues. Right now, we'll take a look at some eligible projects that are eligible, or what looks like a eligible project. So here we have a road, access road, could lead to some businesses or farms or houses. It's not completely knocked out. There's been a little bit of damage, but it is being threatened by the stream. This would be a case where, yeah, through EWP, we could offer additional armoring potentially on this outer bank, and it would be deemed eligible because we were not working on repairing the road. That's statutory. That's against the law with EWP. So we don't want to go there with EWP, but we can certainly protect it. And so here's an example of what that site looked like afterwards. The road remains, and in stream work to stabilize the site. Here's another one. This is down east, North Carolina. Drainage channel completely wiped out. Servicing or some homes were along this further up in the photo, came in and restabilized the bank and applied some full riprap in sections where there's half or less, a third just at the toe. And for a cost efficiency, this is really the preferred measure because at least this happens in stream complexes. I'm on my various soapboxes during this presentation, so your patience is appreciated. But if you do fully armor one side of a stream, and I've seen plenty of situations like this with landowners, they're protecting their property. You armor this side. If you don't do anything to that side, the next big event, all that energy that used to come against this slope and erode it will be reflected and forced over into the other slope or forced to move downstream and cause erosion down there. So I really like this partial approach, especially for emergency measures. Armor the toe, get that base flow armored around the base flow, but then on the rest of the slope it back, get it in the vegetation, and you just see if it holds. I mean, we've got plenty of streams and creeks and rivers in North Carolina now. They're completely rearranged. Anything that might have been there man-made before is completely wiped out, and the river has won. Nature has won again. So again, just from an efficiency standpoint, to stabilize it and protect lives and property for the folks that are there. But it's, nature wins in the end, so just keep that in mind. Let's see, here's a situation, a bridge being threatened by a large pile of debris that was left behind. Yes, a new event could remobilize that debris, so that's been removed. Potentially some armoring also to the abutments to prevent those from being washed out. Protection. With EWP, the main thing is protection, and that's actually in the program name. So let's see, here's a situation, vertical cut bank eroded. the road's being threatened. This infrastructure here is not damaged, it's being threatened. So they're able to come in, refill, regrade this slope, revegetate it, and adds a grade stabilization structure, a 410 structure, to handle the flow, this outlet back into the creek or river down here. And let's say this road had been damaged. Again, this is where it'd be a negotiation. Maybe from just off the road, the sponsor, whoever is responsible for repairing the road and the immediate shoulder, but then EWP could be applied to the remainder of the site. So it really is a site by site. That's the interesting thing, and interesting thing with EWP as we go about assessing sites is there's a lot of room for being creative while also being practical. Here's the situation: debris removal, again, just before and after. There'll be a lot of that going on. That's Conservation Practice Standard 326. And at least in North Carolina, you'll need to discuss this with your new estate engineer, but I include along with debris, and it can be woody. Obviously, if it's treated lumber and trash and stuff like that, I consider that hazardous debris, so that should be removed. And then I also include storm deposited sediment removal under CPS 326 as well. I think it fits in the standard, but that is a determination made by your state engineer, respective state engineers. So let's see, bank stabilization before or after. This is down East Jacksonville. A crossing, again, the erosion threatening some park area and parking lots went in here, regraded it. And again, I appreciate the design here that the contractors came up with, because it's not completely armoring the site, but it's using a mix of rock to stabilize the toe, the slope in the toe, and then vegetate up above. And I think in the long run, that'll work, just perform much better. There could be the act of God that does come through and wipes out what's been done. But overall, I think nature does, there's a long history of nature healing itself as well. So we need to let nature do its work. We augment it. Clearing and snagging. This was an interesting one. This is a bridge that had washed into the creek from a storm. The sponsor was interested in repurposing this bridge at another site. So we assisted them with removing it and taking out any associated debris from the channel. And they actually did end up moving it, reusing it in another site. Here's one where there's a cut bank threatening a business. Paper, some sort of paper processing or paper factory or printing factory. So this will come up in the forms. We'll cover that in the next hour. Now, I promise there'll be a break in there as well. But you do account for the value of the building, the business losses that could occur. This cut bank is threatening the building. Went in here. This was rather an involved project because it was such a steep, and I think it was like maybe a 30 or 40 foot drop down to the river. So let's see, here's where there's been some damage to a spillway on a pond that's just upstream. So came in, and I believe this was a park as well, came in here and regraded that and revegetated it. See, shoreline protection. This is on the inner banks for North Carolina. This was a very interesting, this was a spit out in Whitaker Point out near the town of Oriental, which is way on the inner banks there, North Carolina. He assisted the town itself had already gotten some grant money for doing the work to restore this peninsula of land, and with EWP we're able to provide assistance on the rock riprap, but they actually did the rest of the revegetation and reestablishment through other funds and grants. So with other state and private foundation grants. So not other federal funds were applied on this site. See, here's one. It was a spillway that eroded on one of our PL 566 structures at the outlet. It was kind of a weird design. So we went in and put in some what they call Fleximat material, a kind of a chute, an outlet chute, instead of just dropping it over a sharp vegetated drop off, and some riprap at the bottom. And I believe it's performed okay, but I will definitely want to be following up on that. So for our PL 566 structures, EWP can be utilized for emergency repairs, although we do have situations where, you know, it may be argued, is it really a result of the storm, or is it a result of lack of O&M, or should that really be part of the O&M for the structure? In this case, because the outlet of the emergency spillway was damaged, I saw it as more of a potential design issue with the original installation. So we went ahead and applied EWP to this site and got it approved, and it went through. Let's see. As always with all of our work, so emergency watershed protection program, it's really recovery conservation planning. So you go through the same 9 steps, which I do expect everyone in North Carolina, and I'm going to require it for South Carolina too, because I'm still acting state conservation engineer. We should be, as professional conservationists, we should have these steps memorized. It's like soil scientists memorize soil groups. As conservationists, we should have these 9 steps memorized regardless of our position. Identify the problem, determine objectives, inventory resources, analyze the resources, formulate alternatives, evaluate the alternatives, make decisions, implement the plan, and evaluate the plan. Oh, let's see. What else do I have? Okay, ineligible projects. Almost through with this part of the program, so hang in there. Ineligible projects, and I'll just show some pictures that give some examples of that. If I see a picture like this for a particular site, my first questions are going to be, what's the issue? What's being protected? EWP is just not to clean out waterways if there's no purpose or there's no benefit really for it. Now, people could say, well, upstream, the benefit will be it'll run faster and stuff like that. We really want to be conscious of what we're doing with EWP. The funds are not endless, as I said. So if I saw a photo like this, somebody said, hey, here's a potential site for EWP, I would say it's ineligible. There's really no criteria that are met. I'm seeing a channel with wood across it. That can happen naturally as well. What's what are we really protecting and saving for, or protecting from an imminent threat? Kind of related to Jeff's earlier question. So this is an example of, well, there's a drainage ditch here. It got clogged, but you can tell from these large trees growing in the drainage ditch itself that this hasn't been maintained. And that's one thing, especially with sponsors, to share with our sponsors if we do have positions where we interact with them. If our sponsors can demonstrate that they've had an O&M plan or operation in effect for a particular stretch of ditches or dams or ponds or whatever might be the case, if they have an O&M record of them maintaining it, then that makes it eligible for FEMA assistance. That's one thing I learned from our contractors after Florence. So it's really good practice for our landowners and for our sponsors. If they have, anytime you have an engineered structure installed, that's an O&M item for the rest of their lives, really. And so if they maintain it, that just helps it perform better. If it does get affected by a disaster, if it's a sponsor, it's an eligible sponsor, then that does also make it eligible for potential FEMA assistance as well. And if it's just areas that are low-lying and flood, it just doesn't fit in. If it's a low-lying area that floods a lot, small rains, big rains in particular, we really can't address that through EWP. That's just the situation, and a lot of eastern North Carolina kind of falls into this kind of sites where if you're going to flood out just because of where you're located, and some of that can be caused by development and changes in the watershed, but that's still not something that EWP should really be addressing. Just not eligible. And final one, driveway, the culvert gave way or washed out. That's just not EWP. It's a transportation facility, and like I said, that's in the statute, the CFR 702 or something like that. Actual federal record that transportation facilities, be they public or private, repair of, that's out of EWP's realm. Can't do it through EWP. If the landowner qualifies for EQIP, they might get it done through access roads and 587 structure for water control, but not through EWP. That's the end of the slides for the first part. Are there additional questions?
Jim, we had a question in the chat from Jeffrey. I think you might have answered it. Jeffrey, did he answer that question you put in there?
Yeah, he talked about the EWP manual. So that's good.
Just wanted to double check. It looks like we have a hand up.
Josh Hammond.
Jim, for businesses, and it comes to valuation, are we talking just about the valuation of the buildings themselves, or is it everything, like the building, equipment inside, potential wages for people who might work there, etc.?
It can, although we need to be very careful of what the time frame is when we document it in our damage survey report. If the business is being affected, and say if it were to get impacted, then 10% of the building would be out of commission for a couple of months. Then you have to document it that way, and provide some justification on our economics of how we got there. Now, South Carolina, you do have an economist on your staff. You may want to borrow her for some of our stuff, but that's where I'd expect them to come into play. It's a bit of a, I don't want to say it's a mix of art and science. Whatever data you collect, as you're collecting as you're inventorying our resources, then that would be a part of the picture. So it's going to be site by site, Josh. Might be just the building. It could affect also, if it's employing some people, affect if the building's out of commission for a couple of months, what the business losses that they might be suffering, things like that.
I appreciate it, Jim.
All right. Other questions? If not, and as always, we can handle questions later on. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll be back at 2:00. Zach, can you start a timer or start a clock on this screen? We'll come back at 2:00, and I will be looking at least how North Carolina, what we have for it, and most of it will apply to South Carolina. We're looking at the DSR form, what I call the PDM 20 form, that's filled out during site assessments. So, all right, we'll see everyone in a few.